We're only going to provide serious opportunities for people who grew up outside London, as I did, in London, if house prices, whether to rent or to buy, are similar to they were in the mid-90s when I moved to London. It was a normal thing to do then. Any graduate could do it easily, and many non-graduates as well. That dream is dead.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and this week we're looking at housing taxation. The UK's housing market has long been a source of frustration for renters and homeowners alike, with issues of affordability and availability topping the agenda. The new government has, quite understandably, identified housing market failures as a major barrier to economic growth. But what role does the tax system play in these challenges? We all know that the planning system is an issue, but in this episode we're going to dig into how taxes impact the housing market. From the cost of buying and renting to the incentives or disincentives they create for landlords, developers and homeowners. We'll explore everything from capital gains tax to stamp duty surcharges and council tax. Are these tax measures helping or hindering progress? And if reform is needed, where should policymakers begin? Well, just as a hint, reform is definitely needed, and we'll certainly tell you a number of places where policymakers might want to begin. Well, to help answer those questions, I'm joined by Stuart Adam, who is Senior Economist here at the IFS, and Tim Leunig, an economist who's a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and a former advisor to a number of Chancellors of the Exchequer and Secretaries of State for housing. So we couldn't have a better couple of people to help us through the tangled maze that is the taxation of housing in this country. I often say that our tax system as a whole is in a pretty ropey state, but probably the way we tax housing might actually be the worst of the entire tax system. Stuart, let's just start with you for a sort of quick take on what sort of taxes are we talking about when we're talking about the taxation of housing?
So there are a few taxes that are specific to housing, the big ones being council tax and stamp duty land tax as it technically is in England, and there are Scottish and Welsh devolved equivalents. But there's also the question of how housing fits into the whole of the rest of the tax system. So housing is a consumption good. It's something you live in, you enjoy it. The ONS says it's over a fifth of all of our household consumption. And it's also an asset. Over a third of household wealth is held in housing. So for the person living in it, it's a consumption good. For the owner, it's an asset. And so you can think about how all of the other ways that we tax consumption and assets apply to housing, whether that's income tax, capital gains tax, VAT, inheritance tax, and so on. Housing fits into the whole of the rest of the tax system.
But the two specific ones people normally think about are, as you say, stamp duty, land tax and council tax. Tim, the extraordinary thing about those two taxes is I think we all know, all us economists, which counts as all right-thinking people, know that these are terrible taxes, and yet there's been no real effort to reform them. Let's start with council tax. How does that work, and why do we think it's not very good?
I think you and I agree it's not very good, but you think it's worse than I think it is. I'm not going to endorse your description of terrible. So way back in the midst of time when we were all younger and I had hair, we revalued housing after the poll tax and worked out their values, and we stuck all houses in bands, and that's it. And then any house built since then, a surveyor has to work out what it would have been valued at in 1991 and put it in a band. And that's its band. And then the council sets a rate for so-called band D, which is actually houses somewhat above average. And all the other bands are on a national, this is for England, ratio from that. And over the last few years, council tax has gone up a lot since 2010 because local government has been starved of cash. And so they've had to fill holes. They've also had a lot more temporary accommodation and homelessness. They've had a lot more adult social care to cover. So council tax bills have gone up a lot. And one of the ways in which I think I'm less pessimistic than you are...
Oh, that's good to hear.
Well, it doesn't say much, does it?
That's true. That is true.
Is that the problems with council tax, for sure, you wouldn't start from here. But the big problem is just how big it is. If council tax was only half what it was, the problem wouldn't be nearly as big. And similarly, the sort of wrinkles around the edge, the famous statistic that whatever it is, Buckingham Palace pays less than a 4-bedroom house in Blackpool, isn't really a function of council tax, it's a function of local government support. We give far too much money to Westminster, so Westminster has very low council tax bills for everyone. If we took away the, 650 million of excess support to central London, then people in London would pay roughly the same as people in Gateshead. And that would get rid of, I think, of a lot of the things that allows you to appear on the telly with your nice headline factoid about Buckingham Palace. And since you'll be on the telly for many other things, that isn't really any loss to you, but it would be a gain for the rest of the country, because you could say something different and equally interesting for a change.
Come on, Stuart, be more miserable. It's much worse than that, surely.
I think Tim's description is largely right, but I think I'd be more unhappy about it than he is. I think, for one thing, the fact that we still tax people based on the relative values of their properties in 1991 is absolutely inexcusable. And can you imagine if we levied income tax based on what different jobs paid in 1991? You'd just never dream of it. If we're going to have a property tax, it should be based on what properties are worth now, not what they were worth or would have been worth if they'd been built back a quarter of a century and more ago.
Third of a century now.
Third of a century now, absolutely. And in terms of the, Buckingham Palace versus a house in Blackpool, yes, part of that is about how we fund local government and how much grant central government gives to local authorities in different parts of the country, and we should be bringing that up to date as well to reflect the fact that some parts of the country have become better off and some have become worse off. But it's also the fact that council tax rises nowhere near in proportion to the value of a property, even in proportion to the 1991 value of the property. So even if you were to take an ordinary house near Buckingham Palace, if there were to be such a thing, or a mansion in Blackpool versus a small house or flat in Blackpool, yes, the big property would pay a bit more, but it wouldn't pay a lot more, whereas it is an awful lot more valuable. I think that's pretty hard to justify.
But this is the question, right? What is the point of council tax? Ultimately, local authorities need to fund local services, so they need a tax base. And for years, the Liberal Democrats, for example, supported local income tax. In the US, you have local sales taxes. But both of those are very problematic in the British context because we have very small local authorities. So if one area set a higher income tax, rich people could move out. Indeed, already Burnley and Barnsley, for example, would have a very low tax base if we had local income tax instead of council tax.
They've got pretty low tax base. They've got pretty low tax base in terms of property because they've got a lot of Band A properties.
It's nowhere near as low as it would be for income tax. And Stuart can do the calculations. He'll back me up on that. Both he and I have done those calculations. And that's why you need a regressive tax base locally.
Why do you need a regressive tax base?
Because if you have a progressive one...
You could have a proportional one.
No, if you have a proportional one, unless you have massive transfers from national government, they would have to be much larger because a proportional tax base will reduce the tax base in Burnley and Barnsley and undercut local democracy.
You're actually in favour of this regressive base for council tax? I'm quite
surprised. Yes, absolutely. Because it doesn't make any difference, the regressiveness of one element of the tax system. And I'm sure the IFS orthodoxy is you should look at the regressive and progressive nature of the tax system as a whole rather than individual elements.
Yeah, what we're doing here is getting into the potential trade-offs between local taxation and democracy and a sensible national tax. Now, I think if we were designing a national tax, I assume we would all agree that something like a proportional council tax would make more sense. I mean, Tim's takes the view that because this is a local authority tax, that having it as a proportional tax across the country would mean that somewhere like Burnley, where houses on average are relatively cheap, would raise a lot less itself, and therefore we would need a lot more redistribution from the centre. And I think Stuart is saying, well, fine, let's just have some more redistribution from the centre. And I have to say, I think that's probably where I would go on that. I mean, it's not...
And I would say, look at what's happened since 2010, in which central government has starved the north of England of money, and think how much worse that would have been had there not been a regressive tax base for Burnley. Because otherwise you will get rates, if the local council can adjust the rate and Burnley ends up with a rate 2, 3, 4 times as high as in the south of England in order to raise £1,000, then I think, first of all, the democratic legitimacy collapses, and I think people will shy away from going to places like Burnley because the headline tax will appear much worse than it is. We'll agree to disagree.
There are all sorts of imponderables there and lots of unknown ways in which things could vary or could have varied in the past. I think the world that Stuart and I are envisaging is one in which you start with the current level of overall central government funding to local government. You shift the way in which council tax works such that Chelsea raises a lot more and Burnley raises rather less, and you redistribute so that overall they've got the same amount of money as they do at the moment, with the result that council taxes in Burnley would be a lot lower than they are at the moment and council taxes in Chelsea would be a lot higher than they are at the moment. I agree that this requires the potentially absurd belief that the governments would then not do stupid things into the future, which ended up starving different councils of different amounts.
Well, I can tell you, Paul, the day you assume government will never do something stupid in the future is the day you have lost contact with reality.
Well, we spent quite a lot of time on council tax, and we haven't even got on to one of Stuart's favourite irritations with it, which is that there is a single-person discount. Do you want to take us very briefly through why you don't like the single-person discount, Stuart?
Yeah, so first of all, just to explain what it is, if you are the only adult living in a property, then you can get a 25% discount on your council tax. Now, that basically, reduces bills for single adult households, increases them for others. That's a distributional choice that the government makes. I have no great problem with that. The difficulty I have is that the discount is a percentage of your bill, and that means it's a bigger discount if you live in a more expensive property or a higher value in 1991 property. And that means that there is an incentive for single adult households to live in bigger properties than they otherwise would, and households with more than one adult to live in smaller properties than they otherwise would, which basically is an incentive for some people to rattle around in homes that are too big for them, while others are bursting out of the seams of their house.
Well, while we're on this topic of the, as it were, the wrong people owning the wrong houses, let's move on to stamp duty, shall we?
Good heavens, the wrong people owning the wrong houses, says Paul Johnson, who appears to aspire to be a dictator in Britain. Well, you're in the wrong house, aren't you?
No, he merely aspires to have a system which is neutral so that people live in the houses where the market would allocate them rather than where the government at the moment is allocating them by giving them incentives, as Stuart just described, to live in the wrong houses. So let's move on in that context to stamp duty and the way in which that has, in my view, an extremely damaging effect on the housing market. So again, Stuart, do you want to just explain what stamp duty is and how it works and why we might consider it somewhat problematic?
Sure. So stamp duty is a tax on buying a house. So any time a property changes hands above a certain exemption threshold, there is stamp duty payable. And because it's payable each time a property changes hands, that is a disincentive for properties to change hands. There can be thousands of pounds of tax associated with you and me swapping houses, in effect. So again, if I would rather upsize and you would rather downsize, or if I want to move somewhere for work or retire to the seaside or whatever it is, stamp duty provides a big disincentive for that to happen. It means, again, that properties aren't owned by the people that value them most. And so it's not a question of our saying who ought to be where, but we would like people to be able to choose where they would like to be without tax getting in the way of that. And stamp duty gets in the way of that in a big way. And it has become a much bigger and bigger tax over the years.
Yeah, it is extraordinary, isn't it? It has grown and grown. I mean, government after government has increased the rates one way or another, and indeed the most recent budget, at least on second properties, increased it again.
I mean, that's true, but the real reason the revenues have increased is that house prices have shot up.
Well, in real terms, they haven't over the last 15 years. I mean, they have in cash terms. I mean, they certainly increased a lot through the 2000s.
We think about,
but we get an awful lot of stamp duty from the most expensive properties.
We do, absolutely. But if we went back to when I first bought my house, when I first bought my first house, which is 1996, house prices were a lot lower then. If we'd have indexed them, I looked it up recently, my first house, and according to Zoopla, it's worth £970,000 in today's money, whereas the amount that I paid indexed to inflation was $250,000.
I see. This
Only I hadn't sold it.
This is Tim and my generation who've done relatively well out of the housing market.
Superbly well. We are the lucky generation. But actually, if we'd built enough houses in the south and the southeast to keep property prices back where they were for our generation, though I am a little younger than you, things would be better. We wouldn't be.
That's certainly true. But do you disagree with Stuart's general thesis here?
Not at all. But again, almost all taxes have some bad element. If we raised a much smaller amount from stamp duty because property prices were much lower, it would be the sort of distortion that an economy would be fine with. So I don't think that stamp duty is the biggest problem affecting the northeast of England, for example. The amount of stamp duty raised in the northeast of England is pretty low. The majority of houses in the northeast of England are exempt from stamp duty. And if I had to list the worst problems in the northeast of England, stamp duty would not be in the top 10. And that's what I mean when I say it's always about the magnitudes as well as the principle. And we all live in London. Stamp duty is one of those issues that's very big in our minds. When I worked in the Treasury, it was very big in our minds because we almost all lived in London. We never, in contrast, really thought about petrol tax because, by and large, Treasury officials don't drive much. But still, for some parts of the rest of the country, stamp duty is not the number one issue. And actually, we don't find that moves are much bigger in the northeast than the southeast. And that tells me something else is going on. So I'm not disagreeing with anything Stuart said, but I don't think abolishing stamp duty tomorrow would lead to a sustained, significant rise in the number of house moves, because we don't see it in the northeast, which is the counterfactual.
There have been some fairly convincing academic studies finding that stamp duty does have a significant effect on the number of transactions and therefore how easy people are finding it to move in different places. Where I absolutely agree with you is that stamp duty is a much smaller issue in parts of the country where property values are lower. And stamp duty, as we were saying, has become a much bigger tax. That's partly because house prices have risen and partly because of policy decisions to increase the rates. But actually, while policy decisions have been to increase the rates, it's also been to make the schedule more progressive. So actually, low-value properties and parts of the country where property values are low face much less stamp duty, and stamp duty is much less of an issue than it used to be. But in those parts of the country where property values are higher, it is a much, much, much bigger issue than it used to be. And that is, of course, also those areas where housing is most scarce relative to what people want. And so, we have one problem in this country, which is we just haven't built enough houses in the places people want to live. And fundamentally, we need to be building much more in those areas. And I don't actually think that tax has got a huge amount to do with that. But given that we've got such a shortage of housing in these areas, one thing we absolutely must do is make the best use of the existing housing stock we've got. And stamp duty gets in the way of that in really quite a big way.
So I don't disagree with any of that. But the question is what we mean by using the housing in the best way that we can. I mean, we could go much further and have council tax that as a supplement if you have a bedroom that you don't use. I mean, if we were really serious about maximising, and I'm not suggesting this for a moment, but if we were serious about maximising the use of housing in London, we could instigate a spare room tax on owner-occupiers and private renters. I doubt anyone's going to advocate that. I mean, maybe someone will. I'm not going to. I doubt the IFS will, but maybe I'm wrong.
But I guess the point is that you could go in that direction. We're actually going in the other direction, which is to actually incentivise people to be in houses that are too big for them or too small for them. So, you can have an argument about which way to go, but I think we're all agreed that we're just going the wrong way at the moment.
I think we are, but I'm not convinced it's going to make that much difference. So when I look at the house, I live in deepest, darkest suburbia. I live in Zone 6 in Surbiton, and I live in a row of mainly 4 and 5 bedroom houses, many of which are occupied by single people, elderly people. They've lived there all their lives. They are full of memories. It's going to take more than getting rid of a single-person discount to get the lady opposite me move out of the house she's lived in for 65 years. Because so long as she could afford the extra, £800 a year, she's going to stay with those memories. Similarly, the 4-bedroom house next door to her was recently sold and was bought by a retired couple. And they want that size of house. They've paid the whopping great stamp duty on it because they want the grandchildren to be able to come and stay. The retired couple who moved out bought a 5-bedroom house by the sea for exactly the same reason. Housing is an income elastic good. There are lots of really well-off people in London, and I think housing overconsumption, meaning spare bedrooms, is here to stay in London, and we need to accept that's a sign of prosperity.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. It's just as with everything in economics, you make a change and you expect marginal responses. You don't expect to change the entire world through one change in the tax system. But what you really don't want, which is what we have, is something which makes a problem even bigger than it already is.
Yeah.
Should we move on to, a lot of people listening to this might think that we're really focusing here on the owner-occupied sector, although actually council tax sort of applies equally to renters as it does to owner-occupiers. And if you live in a rented property, well, your landlord will have had to buy it and pay stamp duty on it, and that will have an effect on the rental sector as well. But how should we think about taxing the rental sector, Stuart? I mean, should we think about stamp duty in the same way in the rental sector as we do elsewhere? And in particular, what about landlords? And I think one of the things that you have said quite a lot is that we now have a tax system for all of its kind of idiosyncrasies, which essentially favours owner-occupiers, disfavours landlords, and therefore actually increases the cost of renting.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the tax system now creates a huge bias towards owner occupation and against and away from the rental sector. So the big thing pointing in that direction is that landlords have to pay income tax on their rental income, capital gains tax if their property rises in value, and owner occupiers just don't have to pay that. They don't have any equivalent. Now, that's a long-standing feature of the system. In the past 10 years, the government has been layering more and more things on top of that. So for landlords, they've stopped allowing them to deduct all of their mortgage interest. They can only deduct that cost from their taxable income at the basic rate of tax, not the high rate of tax. We've already talked about stamp duty. There is now a much higher stamp duty rate for second properties, including properties bought by landlords, than there is for owner-occupied properties. And there is an additional inheritance tax allowance for your main home. We've had tax breaks through lifetime ISAs. We've had help to buy, and so on, and so on, and so on. There's just been this succession of additional schemes, either providing tax breaks for owner-occupiers or first-time buyers specifically, or hitting landlords harder and harder and harder. And, of course, when you hit landlords harder and harder and harder, part of that gets passed on to the tenants in higher rent. So the tax system has been making it easier for people to buy a property, to get on the housing ladder, in the terminology that I hate. But the flip side is that those who are still renting are having to pay more to rent than they otherwise would have done.
So all of that's correct. I'd say only two things, which I say in addition and not detraction. There is a case for a supplementary, if we're going to have stamp duty, there's a case for a supplementary stamp duty on landlords because landlords can own a property for many tenancies. So particularly if you have a flat, I sat next to someone who was telling me about their flat portfolio and how many tenants they got through over the last 40 years. The government's only had one set of stamp duty over 40 years of renting, whereas that's the sort of flat you'd have had sequential stamp duty on had it been in the owner-occupied market. So obviously that shows that stamp duty is a terrible tax because a number of times you get it is random, but in that context I can see a case for it. The second thing says there's a great advantage to the state for people on ordinary incomes being homeowners by the time they retire, because it hugely reduces the chance they'll be on benefits. If you're in the private rented sector now, particularly in the south of England, when you retire, there's a very large chance you're going to end up on pension credit because your rent will be so large relative to your pension. So there is something in it for the state to get more people to be owner-occupied by the time they retire.
I think there are arguments for the state to tilt the playing field towards more owner-occupation. I'm not sure I buy one of those arguments being benefits to the exchequer. Precisely for the reasons I was talking about, the more you have housing in the owner-occupied rather than the rented sector, the more the government gives up on the income tax and capital gains tax and so on that it would get from landlords. So it's actually very costly for the government to have all of these properties in the owner-occupied sector.
Well, I think it would be a great IFS project to work out the magnitudes of those two, suitably discounted by the Green Book, under different conditions, because people are retired for a long time, and my prior was that the additional housing benefit that will have to be paid, or pension credit, whatever the benefit's going to be called at the time in retirement, would outweigh those additional tax gains that you get from renting along the way, but it's an empirical question. And I think it would be great if the IFS did that work, and I think I'm sitting opposite the person who is best able to do it.
Well, it'd be an interesting thing to look at. But but whether that's true or not, I think it must be right what Stuart says, which is that the tax system biases against renting and towards owner occupation. Yes. And that is a problem for young people, particularly young people who want to move to London, who want to get a job in the sorts of jobs that you can get in London, which are often relatively well paid and where an awful lot of graduate jobs are. If you're squeezing the size of the rental market and probably squeezing the quality of the rental market as well, that has some pretty big costs.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But again, the tax system is second order to the fact that we haven't built enough houses in London.
Oh, I think we all agree with that. There's no question about that.
There is no question about it. But it must be stated time and time again that the solution to all of these problems is build more houses in the right place.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And the right place is London and the South East.
Yes. Well, I hope on YouTube there's the little thing at the bottom that shows which is the most watched bit of the clip. And I hope the most watched bit of the clip is us agreeing that we need to build more houses in the right place. Because if the listener takes only one thing away from this discussion and doesn't forget it, I'd like it to be that. We're only going to provide serious opportunities for people who grew up outside London, as I did, in London, if house prices, whether to rent or to buy, are similar to they were in the mid-90s when I moved to London. It was a normal thing to do then. Any graduate could do it easily, and many non-graduates as well. That dream is dead.
It is, and you're right, tax is not the fundamental problem there, but it clearly makes it worse, and we should at least tackle those things that we can. But you're absolutely right. Some work by colleagues here showed that the amount of house building in this country is very unresponsive to house prices, and it is especially unresponsive around London, where the house building is so much more needed than it is elsewhere. Let's get back to tax, though, because that is the fundamental point of this podcast. Though we're not going to forget the fact that we need to build more houses. We need to build more houses as well. So we have this situation. I mean, so one argument against your what you were saying, Stuart, is that we're being terribly horrid to landlords, and there must be lots of people listening to this thinking, well, blooming landlords, they're wealthy, they own extra properties, they're exactly the people we want to be horrid to.
I'm not sure owning properties makes landlords horrid. There are certainly some horrid landlords around.
I said it made them wealthy, and therefore we might want to be horrid to them.
Yeah, if you want to tax people with high income or high wealth, then fine, do it. And I think that would apply to owner-occupiers as well as landlords, and indeed people who have their wealth in pensions or shares or some other form. It's not obvious to me why you would...
I'm not making this argument, by the way, but I'm sure there are people listening to this thinking, why are they defending landlords who, by definition, own additional properties and therefore, by definition, are relatively well off?
And it's also true that for the reasons we've discussed, there's been this huge rise in house prices and to some extent in asset prices more generally, which has meant that the existing owners or the previous owners at the time of properties have become much wealthier relative to the rest, which means that wealth has been concentrated in a group of particularly older people who own all the property, all the assets, have become wealthier relative to those who don't and who struggle to buy these ever more expensive houses. And so, yes, landlords and owner-occupiers have become wealthier relative to the rest, more than they used to be. Again, whether that's a reason to push towards more owner occupation and less renting, I'm not convinced by it. It seems like an argument for redistribution if that's the way you want to go. And I think it's also true to say that while you can think of this, and I think the government often likes to talk about it as being a tax on landlords and, penalising these evil landlords who behave so terribly. A good chunk of that will get passed on to the tenants in higher rents. So when you're taxing the rental sector, irrespective of whether it's the landlord or the tenant who is writing the cheque, both sides of the market are going to be made worse off by that. And so, again, while it has become policy has pushed in the direction of making it easier for people to buy their first home, it has pushed further and further in the direction of making rent expensive for those who are still in the rental sector.
And that point is just so important for people to get their heads around, that a tax on these relatively wealthy landlords, a chunk of it, potentially quite a large chunk of it, in the end gets paid by the tenant. And actually private renters in many ways are some of the people struggling most economically in the country, and also allowing people to move to successful labour markets where you probably move in the initial phase into private rented accommodation is incredibly important for the economy. Tim, you wanted to come in.
I do, because this is one of the reasons I'm less keen on council tax revaluation than you two. Because most renters in London are sharing a property and paying very little council tax each on a relatively high-valued property. And if we revalued all those flats in Hackney that are currently shared between 2, 3, 4 people, their bills would go up even further. And I don't think that's obviously a sensible thing, because as you say, Paul, these are some of the unluckiest people out there. They're the people who didn't grow up in London, who can't live with their parents and move pretty much straight from living at home to owner occupation by paying rent into a bank account that they then use for a deposit. And these are not people I wish to rush to attack.
So we're talking about people renting here in share. So my argument would be that actually, if you put up their council tax, at least in the long term, I would expect their rent to fall almost pound for pound. So they wouldn't actually suffer that much from it. The person who would suffer actually is the landlord. It's the owner of that property.
Because that is neutral between whether you're whether it's owned or whether it's owned or rented, whereas some of the other taxes actually hit the rental sector specifically.
You might be right in the long run. Do you have any idea how long the long run is in this case?
Not a great idea.
I guess the point is the long run will eventually be with us, and if you don't start tackling things in the short run, that never comes. We are fairly close to the end of this podcast. But Tim, I really want to ask you something about your experience within government. I mean, it seems fairly clear from everything that Stuart has said that either consciously or not, and I assume consciously, governments over the last many years have been tilting the playing field more and more in favour of owner occupation. I mean, to what extent have you seen that as a driving force behind some of the changes that we've seen in housing taxation and indeed other policies in recent years?
I think it was much more brutal than that. There have been periods when government has needed to raise money. Where we've seen pressure for owner occupation tended to come in spending. So Help to Buy, for example, lifetime ISAs, for example, were explicit policies in order to try to increase the sort of retail politics that we are on your side. We're going to get you on the phrase that politicians love, the housing ladder. The housing ladder is so short these days, it should be called the housing step ladder.
So the increasing taxes on landlords, you don't think was really about moving the playing field towards owner occupation and against renting? You think that was just about getting a bit extra money?
I think it was primarily about getting extra money.
Goodness me, I'm even more astonished.
I really do.
It makes me even more angry.
It was useful.
There wasn't even a good reason for it.
Almost all the tax changes in recent times have had at their heart raising money, because demographic changes have been against us in a way that they just weren't 20 or 30 years ago. So if you think about the sort of ideology and intellectual background of Conservative ministers, they are the Thatcher period above all. That is the glory days. But in the Thatcher period, demographics were with us. So you were able to cut headline rates of high-profile taxes pretty easily without too much behind-the-scenes messing. That's no longer true now, but the pressure for income tax cuts or something similar has not gone away, and therefore the need to raise revenue is... It's really very strong indeed.
Well, it is.
Now, we no longer have, of course, a government that worships at the altar of the 1980s. So maybe we can be more hopeful of more sensible tax changes.
Yeah, but it's an interesting. It's not the answer I expected. I expected you to say that this really was driven by a view that they really wanted to tilt the playing field. And Stuart agrees with you. I'm obviously desperately naive here. I thought there was at least some vaguely.
You've always been naive, Paul. That's what everyone here says about you.
I think my view on this is that, and I speak as a political outsider, my view on this is that the measures that the government has taken to give discounts for first-time buyers and for owner occupation were a deliberate attempt to level the playing field, to make it easier to get on the housing ladder. Whereas I think the tax rises for landlords have been to raise revenue because landlords have been seen as basically an easy target.
Landlords have gained a huge amount from the acceleration of house prices.
As have owner-occupiers.
As have owner-occupiers, but therefore, from government's point of view, there was a sense, not that this was a windfall tax on landlords, but that somehow this was unearned, rather than being, as Stuart said, a conscious way of trying to change the owner-occupation rental mix.
Well, that's as I say, I think I find that even more disappointing, particularly because when you're doing things like increasing stamp duty and for a lot of people changing the income tax treatment, it stops new landlords coming into the market. So it's not even necessarily a windfall tax on current landlords. It's just something that stops anyone else getting in on that particular game. So I'm even more depressed by the irrationality of tax policy than I thought I would be.
Being depressed is why you came to work at the IFS.
It's certainly part of my part of my mental makeup. We are going to have to bring this fascinating and to my mind surprisingly multifaceted conversation to an end. It really has been. There's a lot more I know Stuart would like to talk about, including the taxation of furnished lets, but perhaps we'll have to keep that particular excitement for another day. But stamp duty, council tax, the changes between rental and owner-occupied housing, all of those things matter. But to repeat what Tim has said and what Stuart has agreed with and I have agreed with, the most important thing is that we build more houses in the right places. But at least if we're not going to manage that, at least let's stop making things even worse by having such a terrible tax as stamp duty. And Stuart and I at least agree, and not having this irrationally regressive, out-of-date council tax. At least try and bring that up to date and make it proportional to property value. Though Tim begs to differ on that particular one. So thank you for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work, please do visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We will see you next time.